Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Amanda Montell, and I'm the author of a book called Cultish, host of the podcast Sounds Like a Cult. And today we're diving into a story that's as disturbing as it is revealing, a story about parenting, power, faith, fame, mental health, and the cult-like dynamics that can flourish in plain sight. We're here to discuss Ruby and Jodi, A Cult of Sin and Influence, an upcoming ID documentary that unpacks the twisted relationship between Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt. The four-part docuseries will premiere on September 1st and 2nd at 9/8 Central on ID and will be available to stream on HBO Max and Discovery Plus. Joining me are the incredible filmmakers behind the project, Olivia Crist Grant and Lauren Andrade, executive producers with Chick Entertainment, featured contributor in the docuseries, John Dehlin, a cappella star, who brings a unique lens to this conversation as the host of the Mormon Stories podcast. And then, of course, we have Forteza Latifi, whose upcoming book, Like, Follow, Subscribe, dives deep into the child influencer industry. So let's get right into it. I would love to start with some questions for the filmmakers. This case has been a national media fixation since the authorities were first called to Jodi's home. Olivia and Lauren, you've been working on this documentary since Ruby and Jodi's arrests. What would you say differentiates this project from others out there? There's been a lot of media coverage of this case. In other words, what details of this story did you think were missing from a lot of that coverage that you certainly wanted to explore and expose?
Yeah. So I think that, we're all kind of familiar at this point with Ruby Franke, but I think what the public isn't as familiar with is the fact that Jodi has been an active therapist in Utah for a very, very long time. And she's affected a lot of families. And really the goal of this series was to, give those other folks a voice who have been affected by Jodi Hildebrandt, because the scope really goes beyond the Franke family, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we wanted to really go beyond the headlines. There's actually a documentary that came out a little bit before this, and we're actually very grateful because it was able to provide a lot of context and the groundwork for us to then be able to really dig deeper and ask those burning questions. How did this happen? How did we get here? And really who is to blame here? And what we found was just a lot.
Oh my God. It's stupefying because I think a lot of people who are already familiar with this story conceived of Ruby Franke as the mastermind behind these events and these horrible abuses. And as this series reveals, that's not exactly the case. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, why did you think it was still important to revisit her story in at least this opening episode of the series? And I'm so curious how you even came to discover how deep the Jodi side of things really went.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. I think that, originally when we were doing this series, we actually wanted to focus on family vloggers. And then it came on the news that Ruby was arrested. And we're like, okay. And then we're like, who really is this Jodi person? Who is Jodi Hildebrandt? And I think that was one of kind of the burning questions for us. Because, like Lauren said, there's been pieces on Ruby more specifically in that family. But who is Jodi and how did this happen? And what sort of wake of destruction has this woman left? And we found out that it was a long, years long wake of destruction in Utah.
Yeah, and I think it was also really important to understand the influence, power, and control that Ruby had. This was something that was very desirable to Jodi. I think she kind of used Ruby as a tool to really put her ideas out there and promote the cult. She was kind of like the perfect wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, this is not to say that Ruby didn't exploit her platform and her position, but I think so many people were just distracted by the headline of like abusive family vlogger, and it was very astute of you to want to take a look behind the underexplored name in all of this. In the docuseries and later episodes, you do explore extensive interviews with former clients of the Hildebrandts that come forward to discuss their own perspectives. Was there anything from their testimonies that was so noteworthy and so sort of disquieting to you that it kind of reshaped the whole direction of the series from your point of view?
Yeah, there are a lot of moments. Yeah, I think that what's shocking to me is these teachings are still out there and people are still using them, and children are still being abused. That was shocking because you think, Ruby and Jodi, they're in prison, they're doing time. Okay, this is over. But I think in reality, it's not. And that's what we really dive into later in the series.
Yeah, and I think it was also just shocking once we started talking to survivors and hearing all of their stories, seeing the patterns that were at play and realizing that this was so much larger than just one family and it had been going back decades. I mean, Jodi has so many skeletons in her closet. It's unbelievable, honestly.
Yeah, and those skeletons have had such an afterlife. To your point, it's really hard to squash the remnants of a cultish teaching. It's kind of like Pandora's box. Like once the cat is out of the bag, I'm really mixing metaphors. Let's move on. So from my perspective, one of the most riveting voices in this docuseries is that of Jessie Hildebrandt, who uses they, them pronouns, Jodi's niece, who comes forward in the documentary to share their experience of being in Jodi's care. And they describe being sort of patient zero for Jodi's abusive tactics. Why? I mean, I would just love to hear your experiences as filmmakers of, gaining access to Jessie. And, can you tell us a little bit about why their perspective was so important to include as this sort of patient zero and someone who can speak so remarkably about her techniques of psychological manipulation?
Yeah, I mean, Jessie, if you continue watching the series, I mean, we saw them a little bit in the cold open, is remarkable and brilliant and has been through so much. So just tons of respect for them. But I think their voice is really pivotal in the series because it shows the pattern that I think extends. You can kind of see Jodi formulating her, I don't know if you want to call it like playbook, of how she goes about really breaking a person down and dehumanizing a person. And we see that pattern play out in so many other ways with so many other people. And Jessie does a really good job of explaining how that happened to them, and then how we see that pattern repeated in other stories that we explore.
Yeah, and I think the more that we talked with Jessie, we were able to understand Jodi's motive even more so. And also that, again, this is not a singular event. This did not happen to one family. Jodi has been doing this for decades and practicing the technique for so long now, that I think we just were really able to get a deeper understanding of why this was happening. And it's just terrible.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioning Jodi's motive, which, is sort of, I think, really generously explored in the series. And, from my perspective, it really seems to have something to do with the culture of Mormon patriarchy. And so with that, I would love to shift to a few questions for John Dehlin on your Mormon Stories podcast, which is iconic if you're not already familiar. You explore Mormon culture, psychology, and the intersection of faith and family systems. You appear in the docuseries, lending your insight around the Mormon culture that plays a role in both Jodi's approach to therapy and her Connections program, as well as Ruby Franke's 8 Passengers vlogging. How do you think that their shared value systems, particularly surrounding parenting and discipline, were able to evolve into something so destructive and in a way sanctioned or at least condoned in this complicit way by the Mormon Church?
Great questions. First, I'm really honored to be here. It was a real honor to be a part of the discussions about this film and to be featured. So thanks to you all. A couple of things that come to mind. First is that I was talking to my wife and daughter about this just a tiny bit, but without getting too deep too quick, the Mormon God, and this probably isn't unique just to Mormonism, but can be a very strict and punishing deity. You know, some people might view the LDS Church more as a cult. Other people don't. But what you can see is that how, let's just say, a Mormon conceptualizes God and atonement and justice and sin is very important in terms of how they end up being a parent or being a therapist, etc. And so I think that Ruby and Jodi ended up modeling their parenting or their therapy styles very much after Mormon God, because Mormon God can be kind, but Mormon God can be punishing. Mormon God can be deadly. Jesus' sacrifice was based on pain and suffering, and that is good. And so there's all sorts of theology that informs this idea of obedience, of worthiness, of shame, and of punishment. That's all kind of mixed in. And so in that sense, Ruby, you could even see Ruby as kind of the cult leader of her family in a sense. And then Jodi comes along as well. And so I think together they're sharing a lot in common, and the kids and you could say Kevin were the collateral damage.
Yeah, and I think something that makes the story so unique is that particular blend of theology, which is so up to interpretation and exploitable, in combination with the vlogging aspect and the fame or clout, I guess you could say. And Ruby had a lot of that. So my next question is, you have a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. What do you think made Ruby especially attractive to Jodi and vulnerable to her influence?
Yeah, I think Ruby definitely had a platform, at least at one point, with millions of followers. So that was clearly very attractive to Jodi. I think Janae as well had even more followers with the King of Random. So part of it was influence, part of it was money. Mormonism is sort of well known for multi-level marketing opportunities. And a lot of that is just based on the network of relationships in Utah. So Ruby knew a lot of famous, rich, wealthy people of high status. So that's a way not just to reach the outside world, but also to reach, workshop and seminar attendees. And then the final thing, I think we would all agree that there was likely some sort of emotional and or sexual attraction between Jodi and Ruby, at least from Jodi to Ruby, and maybe reciprocally. So I think all those things made Ruby attractive for Jodi. Yeah.
Yeah. The Venn diagram of like intimacy and exploitation and religion and, missionary aspects of various kinds and money. It's a really weird shape. That Venn diagram. Okay. I'm super curious to know what the response from your particular audience has been to this case, especially those who still have a relationship with the LDS Church.
I think this may have doubled my audience, just this story alone. I think I've been doing the podcast for 20 years, and I think this definitely has been the biggest story that we've covered. Weirdly, it's a podcast called Mormon Stories. It was created for, Mormons and people processing their religion. But over half of our audience now in 2025 has never been Mormon. And so that's something I never envisioned, is creating this niche, super long form podcast, mostly to help Mormons transition. And the largest part of our audience now is never Mormons. And we love our never Mormon audience, but But this story, along with a few others, have been really have driven a lot of growth for sure. Yeah.
What lessons do you think the LDS Church and other religious institutions can take away from this case to prevent similar abuses of power in the future?
Thank you for asking. I love that question. So, something that I think people need to understand is that what drives this story is a couple things. First of all, religions generally have to create some sort of unrealistic, impossible to achieve standard such that the members can start feeling guilty, start feeling shame, and feel like they need the religion to be able to be made whole again. So I got my PhD and I focused on the LGBT Mormon experience. And obviously in Mormonism, it's a sin to be gay. And so I started studying conversion therapy as a way that Mormon bishops and Mormon leaders would help gay people repair themselves. But that's an impossible task. And what it did was it drove all sorts of depression, anxiety, and even suicidality. So that's an example of sort of this impossible moral standard. And the other thing that it drives, though, is it drives the church to seek out mental health professionals that don't go with ethical standards, but instead develop their own kind of niche therapies or coaching like conversion therapy, which all the mental health professions condemn as unethical. Well, it creates this cottage industry of sort of church-approved coaches or therapists that they can turn to who aren't going to give them sort of secular scientific wisdom, but instead are going to tell the gay men in this example to pray, obey, go through conversion therapy, be celibate, get in a mixed orientation marriage, but do anything but be gay. So that's a LGBT example. The whole, there would be no Jodi Hildebrandt if the Mormon Church didn't forbid masturbation and pornography. That's what drove Jodi Hildebrandt. And of course, masturbation is so ubiquitous. It's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but 90+% of men and a very large equivalent percentage of women masturbate. So if a church like the Mormon Church tells youth and adults not to masturbate, and all of a sudden they're all confessing to their bishop, I'm terrible, it's a sin next to murder, and that's something that I don't think is really conveyed here. Sexual sin in Mormonism is literally taught to be a sin next to murder. It's like murder and then sexual sin. And so what's that going to do? It's going to, Mormon bishops don't know how to stop the plague of masturbation. They're masturbating themselves. They are. I mean, we've had bishops on Mormon Stories admit that. So what do? Jodi rises up and says, hey, you know what? You bishops, you don't know how to solve this problem. I'm a mental health professional. I'm a coach, and I've got the solution. And so that's what drives Jodi. So I wish that a church like the Mormon Church would stop having shame-based, impossible standards, and then stop, instead of empowering niche, unethical life coaches and therapists, to instead have a list of ethical, evidence-based therapists and therapeutic practices that their members could go to get actual evidence-based help. And that's something that, you could say that the business model of religion is sometimes based, unfortunately, on shame. So it's hard to imagine the church being willing to give that up, because then why do the members need the religion to begin with? But that's a starting point, maybe.
Such great points. And yeah, I guess this is like a tiny spoiler, but one of the most fascinating parts of this whole series to me was the point made about holding Jodi accountable by the mental health institution, by Doppel, pointing out some of the violations, ethical violations as a mental health professional that she was making. Having her license, was it suspended which is really hard to do. It is so hard to hold mental health professionals accountable that way, which I've also learned in my reporting. But then ironically and tragically, by stripping her license temporarily, she was kind of given carte blanche to give whatever the heck kind of YouTubeable life coaching nonsense she wanted, because now there was no institution to hold her accountable. So this confluence of like the YouTube clout and the sort of nebulous mental health standards and the religion, it's fascinating. It poses a really unique conundrum. And it leads me to a few of the questions that I have for Tessa. So your upcoming book release, Like, Follow, Subscribe, which is now available for pre-order, explores the darker side of growing up online and exposes the emotional, financial, and ethical toll of family vlogging. Why did you begin investigating the influencer world? For Tessa and I know each other, I've never even asked you that. So for the first time ever, what is your answer to why you began investigating the influencer world? And how does Ruby Franke's particular influencer persona fit into some of the more broad patterns that you've uncovered?
Yeah. It's just kind of one of those things. And I think especially as a journalist that you start to think about something, and when you can't stop thinking about it, that you know that there's something there. And I'm sure that that's the same case in filmmaking. And I started looking around and I was thinking about, okay, it's strange to be a child actor. It's strange to be on reality TV. And then I just started thinking, like, what about with influencer kids where there's not this kind of boundary between their work life and their home life? Like, their home life is their work life and their home is their set and their life is their character. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And Ruby and her family are one of the biggest examples of that, because these children really did become characters. Like, you really did feel like you knew them, and you felt this like parasocial connection to them that I think we kind of take for granted with family vloggers now, but it was a very strange thing when it first started happening. And even now I think about the stories that are happening in the family influencer world, and you do feel really deeply for these families. And it's strange because you think, I don't know them, but I do feel like I know them. Like, we just watched this kid shave her legs for the first time. Like, how do I not feel like I know her? And so, yeah, they're a huge example of this.
Could you just, like, for context, explain some of the most common ways in which children of family vloggers are exploited, and how do those things get normalized in this, like, parasocial space?
Yeah, I think just the more that we watch families, the more personal things that they have to show us to keep us interested, right? So when Ruby first started, she wasn't starting by showing her teenage daughter shaving her legs, but she was starting by showing, oh, this is how I like make dinner for 6 kids at once, or like, this is what I do. And then as you spend more and more time with a family, and honestly, they have to up the stakes for things to go viral. And something that I've found in my book is that, and this is something that I kind of always had an instinct towards, but I really kind of drilled down and got some family vloggers on the record telling me this, is that kids who are in pain or in distress are what does the best. That's the content that does the best. And these parents know that, and they're telling me that. And sometimes I'm like, you know, we're on the record, right? And they're telling me this, but they know it. They know it, and we know it. Like, if you think about the content that you know does the best online, right? Someone is in pain, someone is hurting, or someone is having an incredibly private moment. And so a lot of that is sometimes these things like shaving your legs for the first time, or having your first kiss, or a child having a crush on another child, or medical emergencies are like gold. So, which is disgusting and weird to say, but it's true. And just, you guys should read the book, because it's just crazy. It gets crazier and crazier the more that you look.
Yeah. And the escalation aspect, it's not like Ruby Franke's first video was her getting into a car crash. Like, I don't think that would have been well received, but it just, escalates. And that, I mean, there's onus on the part of the viewer too. And I want to ask a question about that. But first, I want to ask, why do you think some of these religious family vloggers in particular, who have really strict codes of conduct for their kids, tend to attract such large followings? And why do you think Ruby Franke grew? I mean, I don't get it. Like, how did she grow her following so fast, in your opinion?
Often the most successful family vloggers have a lot of children. So I think at least 4, but like 4 is like kind of small potatoes in the family vlogging world. And as you get to 5, 6, and even more, I mean, there's a family that I follow right now. They have 12 kids. And so it's just the more kids you have. And I think that's just kind of because it's abnormal. And it's, I think that the average family in this country has 2.5 kids. And so it is fascinating to watch a family with that many children. And so that goes hand in hand with religion. As people are more religious, they tend to have more children. And so they just tend to do better. And it's kind of a match made in heaven, if you will.
I hear you, all the wordplay. Yeah, I mean, if in a particular religion, a child is perceived as a gift from God, and they're also like a gift to the channel, yeah, it's like a win-win, which is such a like freaky conflation of like monetary hashtag blessings and godly blessings. Do you think Ruby's audience played a role in enabling her behavior, and what responsibility do you think viewers have in these cases?
That is a big question that I have, and something that I've been trying to figure out is, why are these people so popular? Because Ruby wouldn't have had this power, and Jodi wouldn't have been able to take this power if we hadn't given her the power, right? Like, she had 2 million fans. Like, that is, I know that we're like used to people having like this many subscribers and whatever, but that is an insane amount of power. And so I think we really do need to think about ourselves and like, what is it? Why do we want to watch these people? What is it about family vlogging that draws us in? And yeah, what responsibility do we have? Because I know that, like, you know, I've watched family vloggers. I have like my favorite like mom influencers that I watch even now that I'm just like, I just can't look away. But it's like, but is that a good enough reason to be watching? I don't know.
Yeah, it presents such a unique ethical quandary of our time. At this point, I'm just like, I'll just wait for the family vlogger true crime series to come out, and then I'll just get caught up at the end, you know, when it all goes south. All right. I have some questions that I feel like we can sort of popcorn because they apply to all of your backgrounds and relationships to this project. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of this story? Maybe we can start with the filmmakers.
I think Jodi is. I think, and again, that's why we were so keen to explore who is this woman, what makes her tick, how did she become, you know, this person. I think it's this idea that, you know, monsters are kind of created, and we were really keen to understand how this happened and who this woman is. People don't understand the depths of manipulation and power she was really able to wield over all of these families, including the Frankes. And that's not to exonerate Ruby or, you know, Kevin. You know, Ruby is in prison and she should be there, you know. But I think that it's important to look kind of behind the curtain.
Yeah. John.
You know, there was a point in the film where maybe one or two of the participants basically said, well, this isn't Mormonism. This isn't the Mormon Church. This is just two people who took advantage of a bad situation or were extremists. But, you know, this isn't Mormon doctrine and theology. I would say that's not true at all. I would say that while they were, let's just say, one of the worst cases, you know, that we know about publicly, you know, there are absolutely aspects of the Mormon Church that created this situation. The patriarchy, these women feeling like their lives is so small that all they can do is be mothers. If Jodi Hildebrandt or if Ruby Franke maybe could have had some career that she could have felt fulfilled in addition to being a mom, maybe she wouldn't have needed to feel like she needed to be an influencer. The Mormon Church prohibits being gay or lesbian. Let's just say that there's a decent possibility that Jodi Hildebrandt was lesbian. What if Jodi Hildebrandt could have just loved who she wanted to love from the very beginning instead of marrying a man that she probably didn't love and then having a failed marriage with, you know, being a failed mom? You know, maybe things could have turned out very differently. Again, the shame, if the Mormon Church didn't have this idea that sexual transgression was next to murder, there would have been no market for the services of a Jodi Hildebrandt. And so again, religious shame drives this story. And if you guys think that Jodi Hildebrandt is the only super unethical, abusive therapist in Utah, Arizona, and Idaho serving Mormons, you're crazy. Every week, every month here along the Wasatch Front, as they call it, I'm saying here back in Utah, there's another therapist that comes out as abusing patients, abusing children, abusing clients. Mormon bishops are often found to be abusing children or abusing clients. Not to mention, there's an entire culture within the Mormon Church of hiding the abuse of children and protecting the abusers at the expense of victims. There's a whole culture of the cover-up of childhood abuse. So why wasn't it discovered earlier? when even Sherry herself was calling Child and Protective Services to say, hey, please protect my little siblings. Why did nothing happen for so long? Because in Mormon culture, there's a long history of protecting the church's reputation, protecting the church's assets, silencing victims, paying them off if you have to, and then protecting the perpetrators because it protects the good name of the church and the church's assets. So in so many ways, I'm not saying this is uniquely Mormon. As you know, there are lots of high demand religions or cults. There are lots of abuses out there. But to say that this isn't deeply interwoven with Mormon doctrine, Mormon theology, Mormon culture, is really to miss the core driver of what happened here. When filmmakers just talk about the blood or the abuse or the bandages or the wounds, that's just exploitation. And that's what I love about this film and this series. It's 4 episodes digging deep into the backstory, covering the culture, covering the history, covering multiple victims, showing the patterns and showing the cultural influences. And that I feel respected. That's a treasure. That's a gift to my people, because this film is going to change Mormon culture and change Mormon policies and practices. So that's what's inspiring to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's especially important to hear because, I think the word cult, I know all too well, is a fraught one. It's a subjective one. There's a lot of disagreement about what it really means. I perceive a really porous membrane between culture, religion, cults. There are a lot of systems in place, as you know, in the United States to protect religious abusers. So I'm just curious to hear from each of you, how do you interpret a cult framework in the context of this story from a religious counseling aspect and also from the family influencing aspect? For Tessa. Sorry.
Yeah. Family vlogging is a cult of its own, right? And I think like each of the family vloggers, if you look at it in a certain way, they're kind of their own cult leaders, and the followers are the subscribers. And maybe Jodi was the head of the cult in one way, but Ruby was the head of a cult in another way. And I think that's what's so fascinating about these two specifically, is they both kind of traded off being the head person in each way, which I find really fascinating.
I really have one more question for the group. It's one that I assume many people in this audience are thinking. Do you think that Jodi and Ruby sincerely thought that they were helping people, or do you think that they knew on some level that they were doing something wrong? What do you all think? No wrong answers.
Okay, I'll take it. This is something that our showrunner, Rachel, is a moment in the series that we always come back to, is Ruby's jail call. And when she realizes that Jodi was not telling the truth was that they were abusing the kids. But Ruby was so bought into the teachings that she was shocked that Jodi wasn't telling the truth of abusing the kids. I mean, this is how warped and disturbing and crazy this story is. And I think because of that, I do think that in a very twisted way, Ruby believed that they were helping the kids. And I know that sounds crazy. I think that Jodi was just the mastermind.
Yeah. Anyone else have a take on that one?
I agree. I think that they felt like they were doing what was right. I think, and that's the most disturbing thing of all, is that my wife always reminds me that there's nothing more dangerous than somebody that thinks they're right. Because feeling, being wrong feels a lot like feeling like you're right. You know what I mean? It kind of feels indistinguishable. And honestly, I think they were doing what they felt like. Have you heard of the clobber verses? If you go to the Old Testament, the Old Testament basically says there's virtue in beating a child. And I'm like, that's crazy. And they're like, no, check it out in the Bible. Go look up clobber verses in the Old Testament. There's like 12 verses that say a righteous parent beats their child. And so this strictness, this abuse of children, again, is modeled after a harsher interpretation or a literalistic interpretation of a biblical God.
Yeah. I love your point about how being indignantly right and being indignantly wrong, like all of these hard stances can feel so similar. It reminds me, I just interviewed a brainwashing expert named Rebecca Lamov. I don't know if you're familiar with her, where she has a book called The Instability of Truth, I believe. And she was telling me this fascinating tale about a woman who was kidnapped by a cult and subjected to incredible violence. And then for her own survival, sort of feigned that she was consenting to this brutality. And the abusers were at once mistreating her in these incredibly traumatic ways, but also constantly checking in on her. Like, you really do want this, right? Like, this is your choice, right? In the middle of all this abuse. And so I think, there's a lot of incredible mental gymnastics that goes on within each of our psyches all the time. And this is just a really extreme and violent version of that. Well, I want to thank you all so much for your incredible insights, for your courage, for, tackling such a complex and painful story. Yes. For Tessa's upcoming book, Like, Follow, Subscribe, which is now available for pre-order. You should really check it out. And John's Mormon Stories podcast both continue this work in powerful ways. Thank you so much for joining us. And please tune in to the 4-part series, Ruby and Jodi, A Cult of Sin and Influence, which premieres across 2 nights on ID on Monday, September 1st and Tuesday, September 2nd at 9/8 Central. The docuseries will also be available to stream on HBO Max and Discovery Plus. Thank you again.